we need to recognize that, you know, a well-functioning floodplain, it's the lifeblood of our riparian corridors, our marshes and beaches and so forth. It sustains the physical structure and the biological diversity of these natural areas while providing conveyance channels for water to move, to go from one place to another, and the capacity to absorb excess water, which is really important in the context of flooding, right? And so we have these floodplains, but we also have, you know, so we have a beneficial part of the flooding equation, but then we have the hazard part of the flooding equation. Flooding is the #1 hazard in Delaware, according to the State Hazard Mitigation Council, which I am a member of. Actually, the top 3 hazards.
Listen to my Zoom meeting. You want to listen to it? It's on flooding.
Do you want to put it on this?
Hmm?
Turn it
Yeah, I think we can hear you if you want to go ahead and mute yourself. So the top 3 hazards in Delaware are flooding, #1, followed by our extratropical and tropical systems. These are our nor'easters and our hurricanes and tropical storms. They can bring flooding too, and we definitely experience that, but they could also bring other kinds of damage like wind and erosion. And so they end up being in the 2nd and 3rd category. Flooding is the #1 hazard across the board for all counties in Delaware. And I wanted to start by talking about risk, because we can't really talk about sea level rise and flooding without understanding the risk from this hazard. So this slide just kind of quickly breaks down that flooding can occur from different kinds of inputs. We have our heavy rainfall events, which aren't necessarily tied to like a tropical storm. And that a thunderstorm, you know, it'll just dump a lot of rain in a short amount of time, and it can overwhelm our stormwater systems, our banks, and you know, our creeks. Then we have the coastal storms, which we're all familiar with, and we watch, you know, as other states right now are experiencing, you know, Hurricane Sally and myriad of other storms, right? I think we've got Hurricane V and a W coming, so there's all, you know, there's been a lot of hurricane activity this year. And then we have tidal. This is that natural, you know, ebb and flow of our tides each day, but because we're a low-lying state, and because of sea level rise, which I'll talk about in a minute, the incidence of tidal flooding, sometimes known as nuisance flooding, sunny day flooding, this is where low-lying spots in the community, maybe your road, your driveway, your yard, might get inundated for a short period of time. This is on the rise, and that's so that's, you know, definitely belongs on the slide. And then sea level rise, right? This is and you know, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, but this is something that exacerbates flooding from all the other potential inputs that are on that slide. Sea level rise basically is an increase in the average height of our tide over time. So our high tides get higher, our low tides get higher. And it's because, you know, we have a lot of different causes of it, and I don't find it that useful in some of our discussions with leaders to get into the crux of who's causing what. The fact is it's happening. And over the last 100 years in Delaware, we've had over 1 foot of sea level rise observed. Okay, so our tides have gotten higher by over 1 foot. And locally, we have a rate of sea level rise that is twice the global average. And it has to do with different factors, some natural, some human, you know, driven. And it includes things like we have some land subsidence, which is a holdover from the last ice age. We have ocean currents like the Gulf Stream that are weakening. And instead of pulling water off our shore, the water slackening and building up toward our shore. And so those are some of the contributors to our local sea level rise being higher than average. And the state of Delaware back in 2017 formed a technical committee. This was chaired by John Callahan at the University of Delaware. And DENREC helped convene that group, and I was a member of that group. And we had basically a technical review to look at the best available science and models, and we came out with a new set of sea level rise scenarios for the state, which are based on both global and regional models. So our regional differences were factored, and we calculated with probabilities that we could expect up to 2 feet of sea level rise in Delaware by the year 2050. Another way to say it is that we have 95% confidence that we will not exceed 2 feet of sea level rise by the year 2050 in Delaware. That means we could be a bit under, and we have scenarios that, you know, we can talk about that, walk you through the different potential scenarios. It's based on an emissions future that is sort of based on the current business as usual mode of emissions going into the atmosphere. So what are the implications for the fact that we have sea level rise happening in terms of our flood risks? Well, our floodplain is changing. The floodplain is dynamic, and it does change over time. And with sea level rise and the height of the tides increasing, you basically can see on the top here, the top part of the diagram, you see in the dark blue the 2010 high tide line. And then if you have a storm, you've got additional storm surge on top of that, driving water inshore. And you can see where the extent of the floodplain is for illustration purposes on the top of this diagram. And then if you look at the second part of the diagram, you can see that with additional sea level rise factor, the high tide has now increased, as shown by the dark blue. And if you have another storm, that's additional storm surge pushing further inland than before. So it's basically your shoreline is moving, and it's moving inland. So in many parts of Delaware, we could experience the shoreline trying to move inward or expanding. And that could mean that we have less viable land to build on, more houses needing flood insurance, and more frequent tidal flooding. And I wanted to mention about tidal flooding is that NOAA puts out a great report every year called the State of the U.S. High Tide Flooding. They have one for 2019 with a 2020 outlook. And I have the links on these slides, and I'll provide, I think actually you'll have a copy of the presentation so you can see these links, and I invite you to go look at that. And it talks about, how we are seeing an exponential increase locally based on the tide gauge at Lewis, which is a long-running tide gauge. It has a good historical record, and where our observed water levels are exceeding flood advisory levels for the area. So you can see what they project the increase to be over time. And given that we have sea level rise potentially exacerbating our risks of flooding from storms, imagine you have a sunny day situation where you're going to experience more flooding on low-lying areas, but then during a storm like Tropical Storm Isaias or a Hurricane Sally or even a nor'easter, or something offshore, you're going to see more storm surge stacked on top of that higher tide. So you can have more erosion, you can have the water pushing further inland. That can cause damage to our property and infrastructure. Our stormwater systems can get overwhelmed. We have low-lying agricultural fields, which already in parts of our county are experiencing wet periods, and that can contribute to a reduction in their agricultural productivity. You have a water table right below us that's rising too because of sea level rise. The water table is rising. So then that means there's less soil for which to plant your plants, especially the ones with the long roots. So overall, there's a systematic kind of impact that could happen and is happening in our county and in Delaware. Not to mention, there's implications for public safety. For example, our evacuation routes, some of whom are already in the path of frequent flooding. and we could experience even more frequent flooding in the future. So I've talked a little bit about the hazard, but now in order to understand risk, we have to think about exposure and vulnerability. And exposure is an indicator of the people, the property, and the natural and built infrastructure that's in the path of the hazard. So, you know, I'm going to step back for a minute and talk about COVID, right? COVID-19, we're living through a different kind of hazard right now, one that's not a short-term hazard. We've been living with it for over 6 months now. And think about all this, the social distancing we're trying to do, the wet mask wearing, the hand sanitizing, all of that is to reduce our exposure, right, to the hazard. In the case of flooding, it's more of a physical situation, right? We're trying to think about, well, are we in the path of something? And every system, person, or thing could potentially have an impact, but it depends. It depends on whether not only is it exposed, but whether it's vulnerable to that hazard. So I'm going to flash to the next slide. Because vulnerability is a function of our sensitivity and our ability to adapt to the hazard. And so in terms of people, for example, there's at-risk populations in our society that may be more sensitive or have lower capacity to adapt than others. And we know certainly with COVID, right, our older adults and the ones in nursing homes, for example, who have, or folks that are immune compromised, no matter what their age, they're more sensitive, right, to COVID. They have greater vulnerability. So there's always within our population sets of individuals or groups that may have more sensitivity or lower ability to adapt than others. Likewise, in terms of property, there's properties that may have more sensitivity. And so I'm calling out land use practices and building codes here, because how we build and how we design our structures influences its ability to weather the hazard, to be able to adapt to that hazard, like, for example, flooding. So, you know, it may be in the path of the flooding, but is it designed to, you know, withstand some of the flood impacts or to accommodate the flooding, for example? And our built and natural infrastructure. Built infrastructure would be something like a roadway. Natural infrastructure might be something like our wetlands. Are they in a good enough condition to weather the hazard? If we have degraded wetlands that are already, you know, there's a lot of built infrastructure right at their neck. They're not in good condition. There's no room for them to migrate. Then they're going to potentially be more sensitive or have lower ability to adapt to sea level rise and the sort of the shoreline, you know, wanting to move inwards, or our floodplain expanding, and that can increase their vulnerability. This is just a slide I have of the Long Neck and Angola area, just as a snapshot to talk a little bit about exposure and vulnerability. The yellow and the green colors refer to inundation. So turquoise color is like a 2-foot inundation over mean high water. Green is 3 feet, yellow is 4 feet. This is just on sort of like, this is a very simplistic model just showing if there was an inundation of you know, let's say 2 feet, what that might look like. But overlaid on this in the gray shading are, this is representing our population where we have areas that are 30% or more older adults over the age of 65. So you can see there's quite a concentration in Sussex County toward the coast of older adults. And that happens to be in the areas that are more likely to experience tidal flooding. And then the red lines on the map are evacuation routes. And it may be hard to see, you kind of have to zero in a bit, but some of these evacuation routes, like in Long Neck, you can see they become blurred by the colors on the map because some of those evacuation routes have segments that flood. And of course, you're all probably familiar with Route 1 between, Dewey and Fenwick, periodically having flooding incidents. So this is a concern for us, obviously, as a community in terms of being able to evacuate people. There's an exposure issue and there's a vulnerability issue here. And so risk is the amalgam of the three, right? It's where hazard and the vulnerability and exposure intersect. And which of these three do we have the most control over? Well, you could certainly say that with regard to a hazard, if we take better steps to reduce our human footprint, to reduce, emissions into the atmosphere, and switch to renewables and things like that, we can slowly, turn the ship on climate change and reduce some of the severity of the impacts we'll see. But in a short-term sense, we have the most control over vulnerability and exposure. Who and what is in the path of the hazard and how sensitive or adaptable they are to that hazard. I think it bears saying that this has to be looked at holistically. I'm going to talk a lot today about, kind of land use practices, but it's a social issue as well. That, as a society, we have to think about which populations are disproportionately impacted, whether there's social services in place to support these populations so that they potentially are less sensitive or vulnerable to the impacts. And why that's important is because we ultimately need to aim for community resilience, the ability to bounce back after disruptive events. I focus a lot on the weather and climate hazards, right? But we're living through a real doozy of a disruptive event right now with COVID. In fact, it is an ongoing event. It hasn't stopped yet, right? We're 6 or 7 months into it. That's a long duration event for sure, and it's really testing everyone's resilience. What we want to aim for is being able to weather these disruptions and bounce back. Maybe we won't bounce back quite the way we want, but we should aim to bounce back even better if we can. We want to regain, certainly, some normalcy in our life, right? And be able to recover some of our day-to-day functions. And so how long that takes really can influence sort of the resiliency that we feel and our ability to recover. Businesses that are shut down for an extended period of time will have a harder time recovering than the ones that are shut down for a shorter period of time. Building resilience, it requires a comprehensive approach to planning. So I have on here just a number of types of planning efforts that go on in our communities. Natural resource management, or land use planning, like community planning processes like comp plans. Transportation planning, thinking about which roads to go in and bridges and maintenance and all that. Building codes, emergency disaster and preparedness. And resiliency really needs to be weaved through all of that. We need to integrate sea level rise and future conditions into all plans and designs. You're gonna hear me hammer that point throughout the rest of this presentation. These plans are only as good as if we are integrating future conditions into them. If we're just thinking about today's current conditions or what happened in our past, then it's like driving with the rear view mirror. We're missing what's coming toward us. Think about population change. It's common to think about, well, you're going to build a new school. Let's think about, what's the size of the student population is going to be in 10 or 20 years. But we don't typically do that in all of our plans regarding sea level rise or the intensity of precipitation, for example. So if we're designing stormwater ponds for a new subdivision, our county doesn't factor in how precipitation may change in the future. And that's a weakness that all of us need to figure out how to address. Because resiliency planning can be carried out at different scales, federal, state, county, as a community, and even as a property owner, we can make decisions that help our particular property withstand disruptions more effectively. So I wanted to kind of call out a few specific things about, well, what do I really mean about resiliency? Like, how do you really put that into action, especially in terms of a planning and land use kind of perspective? And so the first is always plan to future conditions. It's not to ignore past conditions. Like, for example, you know, how many tornadoes have we had in the county in the past? You know, that can be important. You know, we can gain important insights from that information. But we can't ignore how weather and climate changes may influence the types of storms we have in the future. The Sussex County Hazard Mitigation Plan does not take future conditions into account. It doesn't even have anything related to a pandemic or a public health crisis in it. I don't think that that's, you know, the county's the only one that does, you know, that hasn't, but think about it, right? We have some big hazards that aren't even factored into our plan. And we have a document that's planning for hazards, which without thinking about how those hazards may change over time. And that, I think, is an important thing for us to think about as the county embarks on a new hazard mitigation planning effort. With anything, with any resiliency planning, whether it's at the county level or, you know, local level, it's important to really understand the risks and document them. So what are the hazards that we're most likely to encounter? What's our exposure to those hazards, and who and what may be vulnerable? And how will those risks change in the future, and particularly noting which groups could be disproportionately impacted. And why? Why are they disproportionately impacted? Are there social services and other supports that can be provided to help those individuals better weather those events? Resiliency planning also means identifying mitigation adaptation options. So this should be informed by science and best practices. We should also engage decision makers and the public early and often, and use the visualizations like that inundation map, you know, to help tell the story. And resiliency planning can be, you know, kind of a conceptual process. It's important to get started. It's important to find the low-hanging fruit kinds of efforts that can be undertaken, because sometimes, you know, the adaptation and mitigation strategies that are needed, they're big and they're costly. And we could become sort of overwhelmed by that. So we've got to be always looking for the low-hanging fruit as we're working to kind of address the larger types of projects. There's 4 main categories of adaptation and mitigation. There's the strategies where we're trying to protect, kind of, you know, sense of, it's like having a barrier in place, like our dunes, you know, we're trying to prevent the water from coming. That's like our dunes. Even our wetlands can act as a barrier in the sense that they help stem some of the velocity of the waves. You know, they tamper it down. They provide kind of a good defense against wave action. And then another strategy is accommodate, where we're building or designing to allow water to flow through. For example, that's why we have freeboard, where we elevate houses so the first level is not at or below base flood elevation, it's above it to accommodate some of the water. And I think wetlands too, you know, in a lot of ways are a measure of accommodation too, because if you have additional inundation, it's okay if that wetland can get flooded. It can handle that that extra inundation. It's better that that's there and not a physical structure that is built below flood level. And then there's the strategy of avoidance. Don't build in the floodplain if you don't want to be flooded, right? Avoiding the most high-risk areas so that you're reducing your exposure in the first place. Choosing the areas to target growth where there's less exposure. And then the final category is retreat, which is, I think Siders talks a lot about that at the university. We have, communities in other parts of the country, whole communities, which are having to pick up and relocate. But retreat can also mean like a buyout of individual homes that experience repetitive flooding. We've had some examples of that in Delaware. And I even think it can mean things like making a decision that if you have a large property and you have a section of your property that experiences tidal flooding, for example, well, you're not going to put your shed on that part of the property. Maybe if you're a farmer, you're not, there's a portion of your farmland that you're not going to cultivate because it's experiencing inundation from time to time. So in a sense, that's kind of a form of retreat. And why adopt a resilience framework for community decision making? Well, because truthfully, proactive planning is far more effective and less costly than reactive planning. For example, just 1 inch of water in a home could cost more than $25,000. Our normal flood insurance, home insurance policies don't often protect our homes from flooding. It's important to have flood insurance. But what I encounter is a lot of folks who have had to get flood insurance because they're in the floodplain. Once they pay off their homes and their mortgage, they drop the plan. Well, it's just interesting to me because now they've built up all this equity in the house and they've dropped their insurance policy. So if that house is flooded, that equity is in danger of being lost. Also, FEMA and National Institute of Building Sciences calculate that for every dollar invested in mitigation strategies, and what I mean by mitigation, because it's often referred to in different circles, mitigation here is efforts to minimize flood risks or risks of any hazard. For every dollar invested in those strategies, we save $6 in future damage losses, basically. Our DNREC folks might appreciate this. DNREC recently carried out a state of the Delaware climate perception survey. They did this, they hired a University of Delaware professor and who carried out a big survey throughout the whole population on climate perceptions. And it was interesting what came out of it. 56% of the population say they have personally experienced or observed local impacts of climate change. And 47% say they have personally experienced or observed local impacts of sea level rise, which is up from the last survey in 2014. In Sussex County, it's 51% of Sussex County residents that have personally experienced sea level rise. So we had the highest rate in the survey saying that they've personally experienced sea level rise. And I'm part of a group called RASCL, the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League. And every year we have a summit, usually in December. This year it's going to go virtual. We're going to do it the first week in December. I'm going to put in a plug for it. The theme this year is Expect the Unexpected, Planning with Uncertainty. And I think that's very apropos for that kind of year we're having. Last year's theme was more related to land uses and water management. And we kind of did a polling in the crowd. We had 250 people there. And we said, what is your community's most pressing water quality or land use issue? And look what came out. 46% said development pressure, 34% said sea level rise. And there really is a correlation here between the two. So I think the population is witnessing, these threats. They're concerned about it. So I'm going to now slide into some particular best practices that I think could help inform activities that go on in Sussex County and elsewhere. So these are more, land use focused kinds of strategies. First is I'm going to call your attention to the state's guidance on minimizing risks of flood damage. This is a report, it's available online, and it was written for state agencies. So as state agencies were like building, DelDOT building new roads and bridges and state facilities being built, like they were giving them guidance on how to manage risks from flood damage. But this same guidance is very applicable to others, and it really lays out principles for flood avoidance with step-by-step instructions. And it's not regulatory, it's just a guide, but I wanted to talk about it for a minute. This is basically the guidance that's in that document. It's first understanding the risks that are present in your town, in your HOA, or in your community. And then, whenever possible, avoiding building in flood-prone areas. So if you can avoid it to begin with, that's your best strategy. But if you have a road that needs to go in a higher risk area of the floodplain, or maybe it's an existing police station that needs new roof and whatnot, retrofits and stuff. Well, okay, maybe you can't avoid that being where it is, but you can then design to decrease the risk of damage. Maybe you're going to elevate that police station. Maybe you're going to elevate that road, right? So how can you design to kind of minimize the risk of damage? As part of that design, they really advocate for using green infrastructure, which is really a word for like nature-based strategies. It's, living shorelines and wetlands and buffers, rain gardens, things like that, that can help, because nature is nature's best defense against nature. I mean, that's the truth of it. And it also looks pretty. So there's other benefits that accrue to the community. And then document your decisions, document the plans that you put in place, because that becomes sort of the grounds for best practices that can be shared with others.
Hi, Danielle, I'm sorry. As long as you're on that slide, if I can just ask a quick question.
Sure.
I'm one for green infrastructure and actually leaving things in place. How do you know of a group that to get guidance on building on hydric soil? In other words, marshlands. Who can advise about the viability? The marshlands are so important, and we've been seeing building on them continuously, and it's still going on. But then do you in your experience know of a group that can give advice about that to the public?
Right off the very bat, I don't have a name for you, but I think
Okay.
that I can look into that and get you a name or some guidance.
Oh, that'd be great.
Either through the university or the state. So building on hydric soil or like in wetland areas.
Yes, thank you.
And are you thinking about structures like, give me an idea of what you're thinking about. You're talking about like how to build homes on hydric soil, or are you talking about?
What's the, if someone wanted to build a house, a proposal, what to look for, or, I mean, what's the viability of the soil? I mean, you don't want to build on something that's going to sink. I'm not looking to build one, but I'm just saying there's a situation now that information would be handy.
Okay, I'll see what I can get you. Certainly soil characteristics can change the more they become inundated.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, so let me look into that for you.
Thank you so much. Okay, sorry.
You can always send your email contact to Yule, so I have it. Okay?
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry.
No problem. Okay, so the next slide that I wanted to share with you is another guidance that I think is really right on. It's from the Association of State Floodplain Managers, and it's called the No Adverse Impact Approach. And it says in their guidance, and the link is on the slide, that the actions of one property owner should not adversely affect the rights of other property owners. The idea being that all of us have rights to property, for example, not flooding, you know, to not having the actions of one adversely affect, you know, the safety and rights of another person. And so what does this mean in the context of, you know, our discussion about flooding and sea level rise and land uses? Well, they basically see green space as community infrastructure. Our wetlands and our buffers, our open space, this is a community asset that provides beneficial functions, right? For example, you know, our wetlands are an important part of our floodplain, and we need our floodplain to stay, you know, intact, those beneficial functions to be able to operate. And so there's a community benefit to that. So if there's actions to fill in the wetlands, right, then that may, you know, disproportionately impact others in the community. So the association makes a statement about, you know, let's think about what efforts could be undertaken where it's, you know, there's community benefits and not sort of one individual. Let me give another example. Filling in the floodplain can be, it's done all the time, right? It's done all the time in our county. In fact, our county doesn't have any regulations really against fill that I'm aware of. So, for example, it's often used to elevate a home that wants to be, you know, in the floodplain, to elevate it out of the base flood elevation. It's used, you know, to fill in wet areas so that we can build roads and properties. Sometimes it's just used by a neighbor, you know, because maybe they're experiencing some wetness and they want to, you know, elevate, you know, their driveway out of that wetness. But what happens is, you know, you're adding elevation, and then the water is going to have to go somewhere else. So if you're, I have an example right in my own backyard. My property abuts up to 2 other neighbors. And a few years ago, one of the parcels next to me was built on. No fault to anyone. They did everything totally legally. The house had a little bit of fill put in, right? And all of a sudden, I lost some old growth pine trees that were at the border of my property. And that was because of runoff. The house displaced some of the natural absorptive, you know, capacity of the lawn, as well as there was some fill. So there was an elevation differential, and my trees got the, you know, the bad end of the stick on that. So, you know, I could put in a berm, you know, I could build up and put in a berm, and then what am I really doing? I'm just displacing more water. And now, you know, the other neighbor, the third neighbor next to me, you know, has a wet patch by their lawn. So that's not necessarily a good strategy. So what I did is I put in a rain garden. This was like in the corner of my yard that abuts to these 2 different properties, and I put in a rain garden with, you know, a dry bed with gravel, and then as it rains, that runoff comes off one neighbor's property and channels through and helps, you know, absorb over time, and without kind of creating pooling water. So anyway, I think it was like me trying to take steps to not cause adverse impacts, because fill is sort of creates patchworks of elevation differences that, you know, rechannel where our water needs to flow. And that can be kind of a troublesome thing to get our arms around. So thinking about fill holistically in a community, you might want to think about like strategies where it's like there should be no net increase in fill. Maybe if you put in fill somewhere else, there has to be somewhere else where, you know, you capture water so that, you know, it all balances out. The American Planning Association offers this guidance on subdivision design and flood hazard areas. And actually, they adopt a lot of what the Association of Floodplain Managers say, you know, to try as best as you can to maintain the natural and beneficial function of the floodplain. You know, maybe it's, if you're looking at a big subdivision, you're kind of, you know, you're thinking about trying to maximize open space and reduce footprints of the built infrastructure wherever possible. You know, you're trying to not create adverse impacts to other neighboring parcels. You're avoiding new development in the floodplain first and foremost whenever possible, but when you can't, then you're designing to higher standards, basically. You're using the best available data to assess risks, and you're planning based on future conditions, not just how stormwater can be managed today, but what's it going to be like when we have greater intensity of rainfall events, which we know in Delaware, our rainfall is very variable, but our climate projections show that the intensity of our rainfall is increasing. So we may have, or we will have, events where we just get dumped more rainwater in a shorter amount of time. So how do we plan for that? Well, I was going to end today on buffers. And I'm kind of feeling a little bit like rattled because literally 5 minutes before I joined our conversation today, first let me just share that I'm a member of the Sussex County Wetlands and Buffers Working Group, and we have been meeting for probably a year and a half now. As a group, the county formed a group of different stakeholders. And, you know, it had representatives from the university and from, like, for example, Center for Inland Bays and the SARG group. It had people representing the development community, farmland, you know, farmers, and a whole myriad of perspectives, which was great. And the group was very collegial throughout really most of it. And we had 13 or 15 3-hour meetings. Each meeting was 3 hours without breaks. So I remember this really well. We had a lot of meetings as we talked about what is the definition of buffers, what are the benefits of buffers, and then really working into like what would go into an ordinance to update the county's wetlands and buffers policy. We got to a point of having a draft, a final draft, and then COVID hit. And once COVID hit, I think the county more or less, you know, had to put it on the back burner because they were dealing with a lot of other stuff. And there may have been things going on behind the scenes that I'm just not as privy to. But today I got an email saying that that the county has basically abandoned the effort to get this buffer enacted, this buffer ordinance enacted. And I think you guys are probably even more aware, you know, of sort of the behind the scenes politics that ended up happening. But we had some council members lose their primary, and these were some of the council members that were championing the buffers. You know, that's kind of an interesting development. But I do want to end on by saying that buffers are a really important strategy for managing exposure and vulnerability to flood risks. Buffers protect the natural floodplain. They use green infrastructure to promote flood protection, water quality, healthy habitats, and community aesthetics. They provide room to accommodate sea level rise and intensifying storms. And buffers are grounded in science and best practices. It's documented. There's lots of material available to talk about why buffers work. And they work, and they're not expensive, really, in the scheme of things. And when you think about the avoided losses because of having healthy buffers, then we're really talking about something that's a win-win for everyone because they protect property rights. they are, you know, they're protecting whole communities from flooding. So, you know, I think we may often hear about like, well, buffers could potentially infringe on property rights because of density. You know, it might discourage density, but everyone who buys that property has a right too. Everyone has a right not to flood. Everyone has a right to water quality and to be safe. So property rights are really, in a sense, like shared by the community. And our natural systems are community assets. You know, buffers that are maintained and healthy and vegetated will really provide a lot of co-benefits over time that really help to reduce our exposure and vulnerability and really promote that resiliency that I've been talking about. And I'm going to leave you on this slide from our state's climate perception survey. When they canvassed the folks that they surveyed, they asked them whether they support certain policies and efforts, including preserving undeveloped. Do they support preserving undeveloped land and natural features to allow for sea level rise to occur? 82% in our state said that they did. Do they support changing building codes and regulations to reduce risk in flood-prone areas? 79% did. I think in Sussex County, it was 77% of Sussex County residents that support changing building codes and regulations. 77% statewide said they support avoiding construction of new buildings in areas at risk from sea level rise. In Sussex, it was 73%. Across the state, 74% support avoiding construction of new roads and infrastructure in areas at risk from sea level rise. I don't know if I have that statistic for Sussex, but I do have for the top one, 80% of Sussex Countyans support preserving undeveloped land and natural features. So that's compared to 82% statewide. So I think there's a lot of interest there. It's just a matter of working together to kind of find that vision and execute that vision, and helping everyone realize that resiliency kind of benefits everyone. So I'm gonna stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions. And I just wanted to make a plug also for an upcoming event that Rascal is hosting on September 28th. I'm helping to moderate, and it'll have our folks from DEMA, the Delaware Emergency Management Agency, talking about a new FEMA program involving pre-disaster mitigation funds. There's a call for that funding opportunity that's going to be coming out at the end of September. And we're also having our DENREC folks briefing us on updates to their new, their existing flood planning tool, which I believe is on your website with Sussex 2030. It's a great tool, very helpful for understanding the FEMA regulated floodplain, which is built on current risk. And they're going to tell you about some important updates on that. So I'll leave it there.